One thing I hear a lot of people complaining about here in Brazil are the taxes. So they say taxes here in Brazil are really high, and the government's trying to take most of your money that you've worked really hard to earn. And many people are very worked up and angry about this. So I thought I'd do this video to look into whether taxes really are that high here in Brazil compared to other countries. And let's start with income tax. So if you're resident in Brazil, you have to pay federal income tax, and then there's also social security, which they called INSS. And the federal income tax is progressive, so it ranges from 7.5% all the way up to 27.5%. Now, if we just compare the top rate of tax of 27.5% here in Brazil and compare it to some other countries, so in Sweden, where I'm from, the top rate of tax is over 50%. In the UK, the top rate of tax is 45%. And in the US, the top rate of federal tax is 37%, although in a lot of states you also have to pay state taxes. So the top rate of tax can be over 50%, depending on which state you live in. So if you do a simple comparison like this, it actually seems like income taxes in Brazil are relatively low compared to these countries. But it's not as simple as that, because you need to look at the tax exempt amount and the various thresholds. And in general, these are quite low in Brazil compared to many other countries. So I mean, if you look at when you start paying the top rate of tax, so in Brazil, you start paying the top rate of tax of 27.5% when you earn over $10,000 per year. So the threshold there is very low. So comparing that to Sweden, you only pay the top rate of tax when you earn over $65,000. And in the UK, only when you earn over $170,000 do you pay the top rate of tax there. And in the US, it's about $600,000. So what that means is that it all depends on how much you earn, whether you're going to pay more or less tax in Brazil compared to these other countries. So I did a few calculations to show exactly how much tax you would pay in Brazil, Sweden, and the US for various incomes. So what you can see in the table here is the amount of tax you need to pay in these countries if you earn $50,000, $100,000, $500,000, and $1 million per year. And these figures include income tax and also social security. So I think what stands out is that for $50,000, and the same applies for salaries below that as well, you actually pay more tax in Brazil compared to Sweden and the US. And that's because Sweden and the US, they have bigger tax exemptions and also the thresholds are higher. And so what that means is that you end up paying less tax in Sweden and the US compared to Brazil on lower salaries, so less than $50,000. But if you have a higher salary, so $100,000, $500,000, $1 million per year, then you start paying more tax in Sweden compared to Brazil. And the same applies for the US. Yeah, when you earn $500,000 or $1 million, then you pay more tax in the US compared to Brazil. Now, I got these figures from various websites. So to calculate the tax in Brazil, I used this website here, which is Unifebi. And to calculate the tax for the US, I used Smart Asset. And to calculate the tax in Sweden, I used this website here. But there are ways to reduce down the amount of income tax you pay. And one of the ways is that you create a small company and then you pay a tax called Simples Nacional, and that ranges from 6% to 33%. This can be very beneficial because it means you don't pay income tax, which is up to 27.5%. Instead, you might pay something around the 6% level. But it all depends on the individual circumstances, if you can do this, where your income is coming from, how much you're earning, and various other things. And I'm going to talk more later on about taxes on businesses. And so the next tax I want to talk about is sales tax, or VAT. And this is one of the main taxes that people complain about when they say taxes here in Brazil are high. So when it comes to VAT, Brazil has a very complicated tax system. They've got various taxes. They've got something called ICMS, IPI, ISS, PIS/COFINS. And you can see some can be very high, others are relatively low, but when you add them all together, taxes on products and services can be very high in Brazil. So there's this website called Impostrometro, and they've calculated the taxes on various products. So I'll just pull out a few just to show you how much the taxes are. The taxes on potatoes, for example, is 12%. Taxes on beer are 39%. And on petrol, or gas as you call it in America, that's 51%. And on cell phones and mobiles, so this can be up to 62%. It all depends on if the cell phone is made in Brazil or if it's imported. So you can see the difference there. Tax on cars as well, so it depends on the type of car. But if you look at an SUV, that's around 40%. But if the car is imported, so not made in Brazil, then the tax can be over 100%. Now, the Brazilian government is going through a tax reform at the moment. They're trying to simplify all of these taxes on products and services because there are so many. But this hasn't been finalized yet and implemented. But there are estimates of what they think the rates will be. But I found this article here, and they estimate that the average tax on products and services will be 28% after these tax reforms. And so what they're saying is that Brazil will have the highest tax on products and services in the world. So the rate of 28% would be the highest. Below that is Hungary at 27%. I didn't know they had such high taxes on products and services. And then below that, you can see Sweden there at 25%. The UK is at 20% VAT, so that's even further down the list. And in the US, it depends on the state, and that ranges from 0 to 9%. So yeah, if this average rate of 28% in Brazil is accurate, then yeah, Brazil has very high taxes on products and services. And I personally feel that when I go shopping as well, especially when I buy electronics and also products that have been imported, they can be significantly more expensive here in Brazil compared to back in Sweden and the US, that's for sure. But one of the simplest ways of trying to avoid these really high taxes is that you buy products made in Brazil rather than imported. Obviously, that's not possible with everything. I mean, for example, if you buy a car, there's no way I'm going to buy a car that's imported. I've always bought cars that are made here in Brazil. And most of the really big manufacturers, they make assemble the cars here in Brazil to reduce down the taxes. And also when you go overseas, you can buy some things there. So there's a limit of $1,000 of things that you can bring back with you without paying any taxes on. So I always make sure that I take advantage of that when I go overseas. And then another tax is capital gains tax. So that's the tax that you pay when you sell some investments or a property or something. And in Brazil, that tax rate ranges from 15% to 22.5%. If we compare that to some other countries, in Sweden it's 30%. In the UK, it's 18% up to 24%. And in the US, it's 20%. So just doing that simple comparison there, the rates in Brazil are lower or more or less similar to many other countries. However, there are some exemptions to capital gains tax, which you should definitely use. And one of the big ones which I use is that you can sell shares for 20,000 reais per month without paying any capital gains tax. So 20,000 reais is around $3,600. Now that's the sales value, not the profit. So you can only sell shares for a total of $3,600 per month. But if you have a partner, they can do it as well. So then you're up to $7,000 per month of tax-exempt sales. And then you can do it every month. So that adds up to over $80,000 per year. And then there's also an exemption for selling cryptocurrency as well, which is 35,000 reais per month. So again, that applies to the total sales value, not the gain that you make. So again, if you organize your sales and split over several months, then that again can benefit a lot. However, it is very important to know that this exemption applies to cryptocurrencies that are held in Brazil. So if you sell cryptocurrencies overseas, then you'd have to pay capital gains tax on that. And also everything that I've said here, the government is currently trying to reform capital gains tax as well. So in 2026, all of this can change. So one of the proposals is that they change the exemption of 20,000 reais per month for selling shares and make that 60,000 reais per quarter. So that's not a major change. So they basically made the exemption from a monthly thing to a quarterly thing. However, there's a big change with cryptocurrency, and what they're proposing is there won't be any exemption to sales of crypto in Brazil or overseas. So they're proposing that you pay a rate of 17.5% on any sale of crypto, so no exemptions at all. So that would be a big change. So all of that can potentially come into effect in 2026. And then finally, taxes on businesses. So again, this can be very complicated here in Brazil. So in Brazil, they kind of have three different types of taxes on Brazil. They've got Simples Nacional, they have Lucro Presumido, and Lucro Real. So those are the three categories, and for each one, the taxes are different. So the first one is Simples Nacional, I already mentioned earlier. So this applies to the smaller businesses, and here you pay a tax on your revenue, not on your profit. So with Simples Nacional, you need to have annual revenue of below 4.8 million reais, which is roughly $880,000. And the tax calculations are simplified, and the tax rate ranges from 6% up to 33%. But remember, that is on revenue rather than on profit. But still, it's usually advantageous for small businesses to use Simples Nacional, but then it can also be very beneficial as well for individuals to just create a small company and then have their income go through that small company and then pay Simples Nacional, which can be significantly lower than the income tax, which I showed earlier goes up to 27.5%. And then the next one is Lucro Presumido, so that's for companies up to 78 million reais annual revenue, which is $14 million. And here there are two taxes that you pay. You pay the IRPJ and then also the CSLL, and they range from 15 to 25%, and then the other one is 9%. And this is based on profit, but it's a profit that is estimated by the tax authorities. It's not the actual profit made by the business. And then finally, you got Lucro Real, and that's for companies making more than 78 million reais per year in revenue. And here again, you pay IRPJ, which ranges from 15 to 25%, and then CSLL, which is 9%. But this is based on the actual profit that the business makes. Compare that to countries overseas. So corporate tax rate in Sweden is 20%. In the UK, it's between 19 and 25%. And in the US, it's 21%, but then you've also got some local rates as well. So yeah, so looking at taxes on companies here in Brazil, the taxes seem relatively high, especially for the big companies compared to overseas. But for the small companies, Brazil does have the Simples Nacional, which means that the rates can be lower. So I hope you found this video useful. So what I would say is that I totally understand why Brazilians complain about high taxes in Brazil, especially the taxes on products. They can be super high sometimes. But there are ways of reducing down the amount of tax you pay in Brazil. So like I said, opening up a small company and then using Simples Nacional rather than paying income tax, and also using these tax exemptions when you come to selling your shares. And both of these can have quite a big impact on the amount of tax you pay. So if you like this video, please leave a like, subscribe. If you've got any questions or anything, leave in the commentary below. So thanks for watching. Until next time.